Hi everyone. So this is chapter 15, the respiratory system. Um, so remember, the respiratory system moves air into and out of the lungs. The lungs are the site of exchange for oxygen and carbon dioxide. The functioning depends directly on the proper functioning of the circulatory system, so the heart and the arteries and the veins and the capillaries. And we divide the respiratory tract or respiratory system into an upper and a lower. This becomes important, especially later when we talk about infections of the upper respiratory tract versus infections of the lower respiratory tract. So the upper respiratory tract, if you follow air coming in, includes the mouth, then and the nose, the nasal cavity, and then to what we went over in class as the pharynx, then the larynx, and then, uh, as I said, unfortunately, the last part is the a part of the trachea. It doesn't cut off quite simply at an organ. It's in the kind of middle of the trachea. Uh, and then the lower respiratory tract includes the rest of the trachea, so the lower part of the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and then the lungs, or you can think of it as the alveoli, which are the sacs where the air is exchanged. Remember that these are all, except for the alveoli, most of these are tubes. So we're talking about like the trachea and the bronchi and bronchioles, and that one example or one analogy is that of a tree. So thinking about a tree that's like upside down and branching, getting smaller and smaller. The tube's getting smaller and smaller. So this is a picture that we looked at. Looking at here's the nasal cavity, the mouth, which includes the tongue, but many other things. But this picture is focusing on the pharynx, which is that shared space for your digestive and your respiratory system. And then it branches into either, well, for us, for this chapter, it goes into the larynx, which is also known as the voice box, because it contains the vocal cords, and then the trachea. And then in the digestive tract, the pharynx goes into the esophagus, which goes to the stomach. This is just another picture. This one is from your book of the same thing, but I wanted to include it. It has a lot more detail, a lot uh, more labels. This is now a picture of the entire respiratory tract, including the muscles, one of the main muscles uh, that controls ventilation or respiration, the diaphragm. But again, it shows if you follow the pathway of air down, you can see how the air would follow this tree-like tube, these tree-like tubes, and it ends with a part we haven't seen in a picture until now. And in class, but these alveoli. So these, they're like grape like clusters, they always say, of tissue, and this is where the actual oxygen is exchanged that you breathe with your blood, and the CO2 coming out. So if this is trying to zoom in all the way to the ends of these bronchioles, the smallest branches, and you see these grape-like sacs. Um, so again, the alveoli are the sites of gas exchange from the lung with the blood. And it's just like we talked about in terms of oxygen getting picked up by red blood cells, and filled with hemoglobin. And then the tidal volume. So now we're talking, kind of pivoting to talking about the amount of air exchange. So tidal volume is the normal amount of air exchange during a resting inhalation and exhalation, meaning a breath in and a breath out. And that amount is around 500 milliliters. It is different, per person. But the important thing is that this is the word that we use, the phrase that we use, tidal volume. Um, and we'll see, like here, that there are all these different terms for different types of breathing, and what we can change, how we can change the volumes. But what I want you to focus on is a normal breath, and I want you to focus on this idea of residual volume. So uh, that we did also talk about, just a quick aside, we talked about this minute respiratory volume, so the volume per minute, just like we can talk about the amount of blood that's pumped out of the heart per minute, which was cardiac output. But um, this residual air is the other side, which is the amount that remains in the lungs, the amount of air that remains in the lungs, even if you were to take a deep breath out. So you can't force this air out. It will stay in your lungs, and that's normal. And the that volume of air that stays in your lungs is there for an important reason, and it prevents those alveoli from collapsing in on themselves, and the lungs themselves from collapsing in on themselves. So we need a little bit of air uh, in the lungs at all times to keep the lungs at least partially expanded. Other and this is known as residual air. The average range of respirations per minute is important to know. It's 12 to 20 breaths or respirations per minute. You could think of, I mean, it's hard to do yourself because once you pay attention to your own breathing, you change your breathing. But if you were to look at someone, or when you do a physical exam or check somebody, you could see this number. Um, so we can look at the transport of gases in the blood. We talked about hemoglobin being the main way that oxygen is transported in the blood. Carbon dioxide is a bit different. It is dissolved in the blood mostly. And this is in the form of bicarbonate through a chemical reaction. And this is this is in chemistry, but just to show you, for those interested, this is like the reaction that takes place. But this is just the idea that carbon dioxide is carried in the blood uh, in this form of bicarbonate is good to know. And uh, knowing that it's not carried by hemoglobin mainly. So that's hemoglobin is really mostly carrying oxygen, not really carbon dioxide. All right. So in terms of regulation of our breathing, like we were talking about the rate of breathing, and we could also talk about the depth of breathing. Those all change. We can change those either consciously or subconsciously. Uh, so we have different types of or ways to regulate that. We have a nervous system, and then there are chemical ways that we can regulate respiration. But the nervous respiration, remember that the medulla and the pons are important in normal breathing. So your typical breathing cycle of inhaling and exhaling is regulated by your medulla and your pons, and your medulla, if when you cough or you sneeze, is your medulla is what regulates those reflexes. Um, when we talk about the hypothalamus, that is one of the emotional centers of the brain. So that is if you're kind of panicking or having different breathing patterns due to your emotions, if you're upset, that is coordinated by your hypothalamus. And then if you decide to have like a more conscious breathing, something like meditation, that would be controlled by your cerebral cortex. Um, so that's intentional breathing. And then chemical regulation, which we'll come back to at the very end, is the effect of blood pH and the blood levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So remember, like we'll talk about at the end, but blood pH, acidosis, and alkalosis um, have an effect on your breathing, as well as your levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Um, so the word we use for decreased blood oxygen. So a normal blood oxygen is 100% or 99%. Um, and a decreased blood oxygen is hypoxemia, we call it. So hypo meaning low, ox is the oxygen component of the word, and then emia means in the blood. So the response to that, if we have low blood oxygen, would be to increase respiration rate and the depth to pull in more oxygen every minute and every breath as well. And that's right here to increase oxygen in the blood to hopefully bring it back up to the normal amount, or at least get as much oxygen as possible into our body because we need oxygen to live. So don't forget that carbon dioxide is an acid. I added this picture just to show you a pH scale. So this is 0 going up to 14. And neutral in chemistry is at 7. And we live somewhere around here, 7.35 to 7.45, our blood pH. So remember that carbon dioxide is an acid. So more carbon dioxide pulls us lower. It brings the pH lower, whereas bicarbonate is a base, and that would bring our pH higher, right? Because this is more basic, otherwise known as alkaline. So closer to 14, or further away from 14 as well. You could think of it that way. Um, and then finally, the respiratory system can be the cause of a pH imbalance, or it can help correct a pH imbalance. We did talk about this in the other chapters in terms of, basically there are two systems, or, two words that we use. We use respiratory or metabolic to define where we're talking about, either the lungs or the kidneys. And then we use the word either acidosis or alkalosis to talk about what the state is of the blood. So is the blood pH lower, which would be acidotic or acidosis, or is the blood pH higher, which is alkalosis? And then we can say, okay, is it due to, what system is it due to? And for this chapter, we're just talking about the respiratory system. So we would say, for example, that respiratory acidosis, so acidosis means that the pH is lower than, let's say, 7.35. So let's say 7.3, and it's due to the respiratory system. That's what respiratory acidosis is saying. And so an example of that would be when our respiratory rate decreases. And when our respiratory rate decreases, we're unable to get rid of, when we're breathing out, we get rid of that carbon dioxide, which is an acid. And if we decrease that rate, then we're holding on to that carbon dioxide in our blood. And so that makes us what we call acidotic, right? So if we decrease the rate of respiration, I'll just say it a different way, then we're holding on to carbon dioxide, right? In our blood, we're not able to get it out as much or as quickly, and that builds up in our blood more than it should, and that brings our pH down, which is known as acidosis. and this is due to the respiratory system in this context. Other examples are like COPD or asthma, or other issues with the lung that cause us to, if anybody remembers, it's called like air trapping, and that's we're basically holding on to CO2 that we can't get out, and because CO2 is an acid, it will make our blood acidic. Um, and so that's it for this, and move on to the next chapter. Good luck studying.